Good evening, and welcome to our broadcast. Tonight, we delve into a profoundly challenging and sensitive question. Is it appropriate to use mental health status in immigration criteria? This issue sits at the complex intersection of human rights, public policy, and healthcare. Joining us to explore this are two distinguished guests. Mr. Samuel Green, a human rights advocate, argues against the broad use of mental health status in these decisions. And Ms. Anja Sharma, a public policy analyst, will argue for its careful consideration in specific contexts. We look forward to a thoughtful discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Reed. The decisions surrounding immigration are indeed multifaceted and carry significant weight for all involved. I believe it's crucial to approach this topic with both intellectual rigor and profound empathy. My core argument is that using an individual's mental health status as a primary, or even significant criterion for immigration is fundamentally discriminatory, and frequently inhumane. It risks codifying prejudice into law. Firstly, there's an exceptionally high risk of stigmatization and discrimination. Mental health is not a binary state. It exists on a wide spectrum, and diagnostic labels, while sometimes useful clinically, can be dangerously reductive in an immigration context, failing to capture an individual's true capabilities or resilience. Secondly, the challenges in achieving accurate and equitable mental health assessments within the immigration process are immense. Cultural biases, pervasive language barriers, and the acute stress inherent in displacement and seeking refuge can significantly distort assessments, leading to misdiagnoses and unjust outcomes. Furthermore, it's vital to recognize that many mental health conditions are manageable, treatable, or episodic. Individuals experiencing these conditions can, and overwhelmingly do, lead fulfilling, productive, and contributory lives. Our focus should therefore be on fostering supportive environments and providing access to care, rather than on outright exclusion based on potentially misleading or temporary health labels. In conclusion, immigration policies must resolutely prioritize human dignity. They should assess individuals holistically, focusing on their overall capacity, skills, and potential to contribute, rather than allowing decisions to be swayed by mental health labels that often lack context and predictive validity for future success or societal contribution.
Thank you, Dr. Reed. And thank you, Mr. Green, for outlining your perspective. I certainly agree that this topic requires the utmost sensitivity and a commitment to compassionate policymaking. However, my main argument is that responsible governments, while upholding compassion, must also consider mental health status in specific, carefully defined, and limited circumstances. This is not about broad exclusion, but about responsible governance. Firstly, the state has a fundamental duty to ensure public safety and to manage the long-term sustainability of its public health services. This includes planning for the needs of all residents, including newcomers. Secondly, certain severe, untreated, or unmanageable mental health conditions may, in some instances, pose a demonstrable risk to public safety. Additionally, some conditions might require intensive, highly specialized, and costly care that could significantly strain public health resources if not anticipated and planned for appropriately, potentially impacting service availability for the wider community. Thirdly, we must also consider the individual's own well-being. Placing someone with a severe, unmanaged condition, who lacks immediate support networks, into the inherently high-stress environment of immigration and resettlement could be profoundly detrimental to their health and integration prospects. It is a disservice to invite someone into a situation where they are unlikely to thrive without substantial, pre-arranged support mechanisms. Therefore, my concluding thought is that this is not about promoting discrimination or stigmatization. Instead, it's about making informed, responsible decisions that carefully balance genuine compassion and human rights with the legitimate public interest. and the individual's own capacity to successfully integrate and flourish in a new society.
Ms. Sharma, you raised the concern of public safety, but I must argue that the purported link between mental illness and violence is frequently overstated and, regrettably, feeds into deeply harmful stereotypes. Decades of research show that individuals with mental health conditions are far more likely to be victims of violence than perpetrators. Any risk assessment, if deemed absolutely necessary, must be highly individualized, evidence-based, and not predicated on a diagnosis alone. It should focus on demonstrable behaviors or threats, not on a label. Regarding the resource burden argument, it's important to remember that immigrants, including those who may be managing mental health conditions, consistently contribute significantly to the economy and society, often in ways that far outweigh any initial costs. Investing in accessible mental health services for all residents, including newcomers, strengthens the entire community and is a mark of a developed, compassionate society. Finally, I must reiterate the profound systemic difficulty in achieving truly objective, culturally competent, and trauma-informed mental health assessments within the often pressured and impersonal context of immigration proceedings. The potential for misjudgment is simply too high.
Mr. Green, I acknowledge your concerns about discrimination, and I agree that avoiding stigmatization is paramount. However, I believe assessments can be designed to mitigate these risks. The focus should be on specific, severe functional impairments and demonstrable incapacity to live safely and independently within the community, rather than relying solely on diagnostic labels which, I concur, can be misrepresentative. The objective would not be to stigmatize individuals with, for example, manageable anxiety or depression, but to identify rare cases where a condition severely compromises an individual's ability to function or poses a clearly evidenced substantial risk. Regarding treatability, while it's true many conditions are treatable, the pertinent question for an immigration system, which has to make decisions at a specific point in time, often revolves around the current state of the condition, its severity, the individual's stability, and the immediate availability and cost of necessary, ongoing treatment or support in the host country. We must consider if adequate support can realistically be provided upon arrival. So, I reiterate, the focus should be on a very narrow set of circumstances involving conditions that severely impact an individual's ability to integrate successfully, or that pose a clearly evidenced, rigorously assessed risk, ensuring that any such considerations are transparent and subject to appeal.
Thank you both for those robust rebuttals. We will now move to a more direct discussion. Mr. Green, you have the first question for Ms. Sharma.
Ms. Sharma, you refer to severe conditions and, quote, demonstrable risk. How would you define this threshold in a practical, objective, and legally sound way that genuinely avoids a slippery slope towards excluding individuals with manageable or episodic conditions, especially when the immigration process itself is an acknowledged source of immense stress and can temporarily exacerbate symptoms?
That's a critical question, Mr. Green. The threshold would involve conditions that are medically certified by independent specialists as severely and persistently impairing an individual's fundamental ability to live independently or to engage in basic self-care, or conditions that present a direct, documented, and ongoing threat to the safety of others. This assessment would need to be highly individualized, evidence-based, considering longitudinal history rather than a single snapshot, and reviewed by a panel of medical and legal experts. Crucially, such a definition must explicitly exclude conditions like general anxiety, situational depression, or PTSD that are often exacerbated by, or a direct result of, the circumstances of displacement or the immigration process itself, unless they are of such severity and persistence that they meet the high functional impairment criteria I mentioned.
And who precisely ensures these independent medical and legal experts possess genuine, demonstrable cross-cultural competency and trauma-informed approaches to avoid misinterpreting culturally normative expressions of distress or the sequelae of persecution as inherent pathology?
That would be an indispensable component of their mandated qualifications. ongoing professional development, and the oversight mechanisms for the panel. It would involve rigorous training and clear protocols for culturally sensitive assessments.
Ms. Sharma, your question for Mr. Green.
Mr. Green, while passionately and rightly championing inclusivity and warning against discrimination, do you concede that there might be any extreme, albeit rare circumstances where an individual's mental health status, if it genuinely and demonstrably renders them incapable of basic self-care, or poses a rigorously assessed imminent and unmitigable danger to others, could be a justifiable factor in an immigration decision, even if only one among many?
In truly exceptional, meticulously verified, and narrowly defined cases where all avenues of potential support, treatment, and mitigation within the receiving society are explored and found insufficient, and where a direct, imminent, and substantial threat or total and permanent incapacity for self-care is proven beyond any reasonable doubt by multiple independent experts, then existing public safety protocols that apply to all individuals, regardless of origin, might regrettably come into play. However, these instances would be exceedingly rare and must not form the basis of general immigration policy, which absolutely must guard against diagnostic prejudice and systemic discrimination. The default must always be inclusion and support.
So to clarify, you are not advocating for an absolute, unequivocal prohibition on considering it under any imaginable circumstance, but rather for an exceptionally high, almost insurmountable procedural and evidentiary threshold that prioritizes non-discrimination above all else?
Precisely. A threshold so high and so rigorously applied that it protects fundamental human rights and effectively prevents the systemic discrimination that is otherwise almost inevitable when mental health becomes a routine criterion. In summarizing my position, I must underscore the inherent and profound danger of discrimination that arises when mental health status is used as a criterion in immigration. Such approaches inevitably lead to the marginalization and exclusion of vulnerable individuals based on labels, rather than their intrinsic worth or potential. A human rights-centered approach, grounded in compassion and understanding, must be paramount. We must remember that many mental health conditions are treatable, manageable, or temporary, and do not define an individual's capacity to contribute meaningfully to society. The focus should remain steadfastly on an individual's overall abilities, their skills, their experiences, and their potential contributions, not on medical diagnoses that can be misinterpreted or misused. Immigrants bring immense societal benefits, cultural, economic, and intellectual, and excluding individuals based on often misunderstood or stereotyped health labels represents a significant loss for everyone, diminishing our collective humanity. Therefore, I call for immigration policies that are strictly evidence-based, rigorously non-discriminatory, and that unequivocally uphold the dignity of all individuals. Our efforts should be directed towards offering support, facilitating integration, and dismantling barriers, rather than erecting new ones based on mental health.
In my closing, I wish to reiterate that my arguments are not intended to promote widespread exclusion or to stigmatize any group. The core of my position is the affirmation of a government's fundamental responsibility to ensure public safety, to exercise prudent management of public health resources for all its residents, and critically, to consider the immigrant's own well-being and prospects for successful integration. It is about recognizing that in very specific, carefully delineated circumstances, severe mental health conditions, which demonstrably and significantly impair an individual's ability to function independently, or which pose a rigorously assessed and substantial risk to public safety, may need to be a factor in immigration considerations. This is not about penalizing illness, but about acknowledging capacity and potential impact. I advocate for meticulously constructed, objective criteria, applied transparently and in very limited, exceptional circumstances, with robust safeguards against misuse and discrimination, including rights to appeal and independent review. The goal is fairness and ensuring that individuals are not set up for failure in a new country if their needs are too acute to be met. Ultimately, a balanced and ethical approach is required, one that carefully harmonizes our deeply held humanitarian values and commitment to non-discrimination with the practical responsibilities of governance and the imperative to foster successful settlement outcomes, both for the immigrants themselves and for the host society. It is a complex equation, but not an impossible one to solve with wisdom and care.
Thank you both, Mr. Green and Ms. Sharma, for your thoughtful, articulate, and indeed passionate arguments on this very challenging topic. You have given us a great deal to consider. You've clearly illuminated the central tension we face: how to balance the vital principles of inclusivity, non-discrimination, and fundamental human rights with the legitimate duties of the state regarding public welfare, resource management, and community safety. The complexities are undeniable, and there are no easy answers. We encourage our audience to continue reflecting on the diverse perspectives shared tonight and the profound implications of these policies for individuals and societies alike. Thank you for joining us.